It started with a bowler hat, then a trilby, a sun hat, then a knitted beanie, all gone lifted, it seemed, right off people's heads. You wouldn't expect that to be the beginning of a crime story. Not one worth reporting anyway. But in the late 1990s in Glasgow, Scotland, over 100 people reported that their hats had been stolen. Not from their homes or their coat racks, but off their heads, in public, without them noticing. This wasn't performance art. It wasn't a prank. And it wasn't a petty thief looking to make a few pounds. As police would eventually learn, the hat thefts spanned over 4 years, crossed 3 countries, and baffled detectives from Scotland Yard to Interpol. The man behind it, when they found him, was barely more than a shadow with an umbrella. The quiet start of a strange crime. The first incident was dismissed as drunken confusion. A man named Malcolm Robertson, 62 years old, retired bus driver, walked into the Maryhill police station in January of 1997, deeply agitated. He claimed that someone had stolen his hat at Queen Street Station. "It was just gone," he said. "One moment I'm tipping it to a lady, the next my head's cold." No witnesses, no CCTV, no real crime to report. The desk sergeant made a note, shrugged, and filed it under miscellaneous lost items. Then within a week there were 3 more reports, all different parts of Glasgow. Same story, one moment the hat was there, the next it was. No roughness, no bump, no confrontation, just an absence. And then over time, they started pouring in. The profile of a hat thief. Detective Fiona Kerr was first to raise a flag internally. There was something about it, she said years later in an interview, a rhythm to the thefts. They weren't random. He'd strike during lunch hours, always in places with heavy foot traffic, never the same area twice in a week. The working assumption was that someone had a compulsion, maybe a kleptomaniac, maybe a prankster obsessed with hats. But there were inconsistencies. High-end hats were taken, cheap ones were left behind. Children were never targeted, nor were the elderly past a certain age. No 2 hats were ever of the same style. There was, she noted, a deliberate eclecticism to it. Then someone mentioned the man with the umbrella. A face in the fog. A banker named Ewan McNeil claimed that just before his hat vanished, he had bumped shoulders with a man carrying an umbrella. It was sunny. The man had a bowler hat, moved oddly, Ewan said, like he was walking in rhythm with the crowd but not with them. Ewan's CCTV footage showed a blurred figure in a gray coat walking through George Square, never stopping, never looking up, but hats seemed to vanish in his wake. More CCTV pulls started showing the same man, always the same coat, the umbrella, the hat, though the style changed each time, fedora, boater, Panama. He was wearing the stolen hats, Kerr said. He was collecting them and then displaying them, on himself. It would be strange enough if this was a local nuisance, but that's when the Interpol notice came in. This wasn't just Glasgow. An officer in Bruges, Belgium, named Corentin Dupuis had flagged a similar pattern. Nearly 50 hat thefts in 2 years, all public places, all untraceable. One witness described a man with an umbrella who moved like smoke. In Vienna, 2 cafe patrons were reported missing their hats within moments of entering. In each case, the CCTV was nearly useless. The man was always there but never looking at the camera. It wasn't clear how he did it. There was no footage of him physically taking anything. No purses, no wallets, just hats. One Austrian investigator suggested he had a telescoping pole hidden in his umbrella, a kind of hat-snatching device. Another theory was magnetic rings to tug at loose brims. But Kerr didn't think it was that technical. "I think," she said, "he was just that good." The collector's pattern. The tipping point came when a Glasgow woman named Irene MacLeish discovered something bizarre in an abandoned storage locker, rented under a false name. She had purchased it at auction when the owner stopped paying fees. What she found inside was a near-perfect museum of hats, more than 300, each stored in temperature-controlled boxes, with labels date, location, and in many cases, names of the victims. Each box had a photo of the original owner. There were no duplicates, no torn brims or crushed crowns. The hats were pristine. But no fingerprints, no personal documents, no clues to identity. Then, tucked into one corner of the locker behind a loose panel, Irene found a single slip of paper. It read, "Every life wears a shape. I just borrow them for a while. H." A signature with no identity. Interpol flagged the note. The handwriting matched similar slips found in Belgium, Italy, and once in an envelope left in a Budapest train station. Always unsigned except for the single letter, H. What began as a series of petty thefts was now being investigated as an international criminal profile. Interpol assigned a behavioral analyst, Dr. Lucia Marin. "He isn't stealing hats," she said. "He's collecting personas. The hat is a symbol. He is absorbing in his mind the lives of others. One hat, one story." It was more philosophical than actionable, but it shifted how they viewed him. He wasn't interested in resale or profit. There were no known financial gains, just hats and notes. The theft stopped suddenly. In mid-2001, after nearly 5 years of activity, the hat theft stopped entirely. No more sightings, no umbrella man, no CCTV ghosts, no notes. There were theories he had died. He had been imprisoned for another crime. Or, as one investigator put it, maybe he finally found the perfect hat. The storage unit remained the only real physical evidence. It was eventually turned into a private exhibit under anonymity. Victims could visit and retrieve their hats if they provided proof. Some did, most did not. Many said they felt unsettled, as if they'd unknowingly contributed to something larger. "He didn't steal my hat," one man said. "He borrowed something invisible from me." But who was he? Why did he stop? And how was it possible to pluck hats from people's heads unnoticed for years? He had vanished. No more hats stolen, no more notes, no sightings of the man with the umbrella. But Detective Fiona Kerr couldn't let it go, even when her supervisor insisted the case be marked inactive, even when the storage unit was emptied, cataloged, and sealed. Kerr kept one item, the slip of paper. "Every life wears a shape. I just borrow them for a while. H." She had it laminated, carried it in her coat pocket like a talisman. She said later it helped her think, not like a detective but like the person behind the thefts. Because if you really looked at the case, the hats weren't what mattered. It was the precision, the purpose, the restraint. Who steals for 5 years, across multiple countries, with no financial motive and stops? That kind of discipline wasn't random. It was someone trained, someone deliberate. Kerr started asking a different question. Not who is H, but rather, what kind of person needs to become H? The museum incident. It would be a librarian who gave her the next clue. In 2002, nearly a year after the last reported theft, an older woman named Grace Willoughby called in a quiet tip to the department. She worked as an archivist at the Glasgow Museum of Decorative Arts. Nothing dramatic, she said, just a missing piece from the hat history exhibit. A Victorian riding hat had gone missing from its locked display. It hadn't been forced open, the locks were untouched, the cameras didn't show anything conclusive. But she found something else, a small piece of paper tucked into the glass seam of the display. "I wanted to know what it felt like to ride into the wind." It was unsigned. Grace hadn't connected it to the old hat thefts until she read a Sunday magazine spread on the unsolved case. When she saw the handwriting sample, she knew. Same flourish, same age. Kerr reopened the file the same day. Backtracking the timeline. With the museum theft, a new timeline emerged. Perhaps H had never stopped, only shifted focus. Care began reaching out to museums, antique hat collectors, and costume shops across the UK. She asked an unusual question. Has anything gone missing that seemed too insignificant to report? The responses trickled in. A fur-lined Ashenka missing from a World War II exhibit in Poland. A papal-style skullcap from a private collection in Rome. A ceremonial crown replica from a small theater in Bristol. In every case, no sign of forced entry, no alarms triggered, sometimes a note, sometimes nothing. He was still active, just quieter, more selective, and more symbolic. But why? A visit to Budapest. Interpol shared their files. In 2003, Care traveled to Budapest to follow up on an old lead. At Nyugati railway station, one of the busiest in the city, a cleaner had found a man's umbrella left behind in a first-class lounge. Inside the umbrella shaft was rolled a thin piece of parchment. She wore lavender and asked me the time. I wanted to remember her walk. That line, simple and strange, had puzzled Hungarian authorities. It didn't connect to any crime. But Care saw something others had missed. The umbrella wasn't modern. It was hand-carved. The initials FH were etched inside the handle. Was H a real surname, or was it borrowed too? She traced the umbrella to a shop in Edinburgh, a specialty umbrella maker known for custom work. They had only made 3 umbrellas with FH in the last 25 years. 2 customers were deceased. One was a man named Felix Hatherley, last registered purchase, 1991. No address, paid in cash. But Care found something better, an old invoice sent to a P.O. box in Inverness. She called in a favor from a postal investigator. What came back was a shock. The School for Silent Hands. The P.O. box had been cross-referenced in an unrelated investigation in the late 1980s involving a now-defunct private security training firm called Lumen Services. Officially, it provided personal security, hand-to-hand combat instruction, and situational awareness classes to government agencies. Unofficially, it trained elite operatives in techniques of psychological profiling, misdirection, and, curiously, nonviolent theft. It was part of a Cold War-era program exploring unarmed, non-lethal fieldwork tactics, particularly for espionage, in urban civilian populations. Felix Hatherley appeared on a single employee list. Role: Instructor in Applied Misdirection. No military record, no digital footprint, no social media. After 1994, no paper trail at all. The program was shut down in 1993. The magician's discipline. Care reached out to one of Lumen's former students, now a retired British intelligence analyst. She met him under the pretense of an academic project. When she showed him the handwriting sample, he grew quiet. "You don't find him," he said. "You notice him, but only after it's too late." He described Hatherley as a philosophical loner, obsessed with the concept of social masks. He believed that most people lived behind hats not metaphorically, but literally. That hats encoded roles: the boss, the rebel, the worker, the romantic. He said hats were the soul's shorthand, the analyst explained. You could know everything about a man by the hat he wore or chose not to wear. Lumen dismissed Hatherley as eccentric, too theatrical, too slow for real field work, but his invisibility drills, as they were called, became infamous. They involved walking into rooms, stealing objects without contact, and leaving behind something poetic. Always something poetic. A return to Glasgow. It was the summer of 2004 when the final note appeared. The museum again, same archivist. This time she noticed a trilby had been returned, gently placed in a locked display. The tag had been rewritten. To borrow is to listen to someone's silence. Thank you for letting me hear yours. There was no camera footage, but the building's rear emergency exit had been briefly triggered just 5 seconds before closing time. Kerr reviewed the footage from the rear street. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a figure in a gray coat. An umbrella, a soft bowler hat, and a slow, steady walk. She paused the frame. It was him. She submitted the image to Interpol, MI5, and every national security database she had access to. No matches, no known alias, no biometric flags. He had trained to disappear, and he had succeeded. But something about the last note stood out to her. "Thank you for letting me hear yours." It felt like a farewell, or a request for understanding. Why did Felix Hatherley stop? Was it closure, or had he simply moved on to new identities? And is it possible that H was never one person at all, but a shared performance? The quiet crimes of Felix Hatherley, or whoever H truly was, never received headlines. No front-page spread, no press conference. In a world obsessed with spectacle, his thefts were too soft, too strange, too meticulous. They did not bleed, so they did not lead. But among a select group of detectives, curators, archivists, and hat shop owners, he had become something of a phantom legend. Not because he vanished, but because of what he left behind. The language of hats. In 2005, a minor conference of criminologists and museum professionals in York hosted an unusual panel, The Semiotics of Stolen Hats. It was half academic, half curiosity and exploration into H's criminal philosophy. The panel's key argument: H didn't steal items, he borrowed identities. A hat, after all, is one of the few articles of clothing that rests above the eyes. It becomes a part of someone's presence, not just their fashion. The wide brim of a fedora might shield a man's confidence. The tilt of a beret might soften a woman's stance. A baseball cap turns a banker into a casual walker. Dr. Lucia Marin, Interpol's behavioral specialist, proposed this. By removing hats without notice, H removed people's outward identity, momentarily reminding them of their inner self. The theft was not for possession. It was, in some strange way, a gift. Many dismissed it as overinterpretation, but Kerr wasn't so sure. She had met too many of the victims, and they all described a strange sense of absence, not anger. "It wasn't like losing a wallet," one woman said. "It felt intimate, like someone had glimpsed a piece of me I didn't realize I was showing." The pattern of nonviolence. Police records confirmed a remarkable consistency across all known incidents. No one was injured. No one was threatened. No victim reported verbal contact. In some cases, victims were entirely unaware their hat was gone until long after. Even more unusually, the thefts occurred most often during moments of reflection, walking alone, riding a tram, reading in a cafe. As if H specifically sought out moments when people had briefly disconnected from the outside world. Detective Kerr once said, "He wasn't just stealing hats, he was interrupting people's stories, quietly, momentarily, and leaving no trace but a chill and a gap." In a twist of irony, Kerr began receiving anonymous letters, not threatening, not revealing, just observations, written in a calm, reflective tone, always typed, always unsigned, postmarked from various parts of Europe. One simply read, "I once wore a cap meant for sailing. I never learned to sail. I just liked how it looked against gray clouds." She had no way to prove it was from him, but she kept them anyway. The quiet resolution. In 2006, Kerr received a call from a small town outside Lyon, France. A local constable cleaning out an abandoned country home found a hatbox in the attic. Inside were 12 hats, each carefully stored: a beanie, a pork pie, a hunting cap, a cloche. Each had a card with the date and location of its acquisition. Most matched theft reports from years prior. There was also a final note. "Every story has an edge where it ends. I have reached mine. The hats are no longer needed. I no longer need them. The property had been rented under the name Fellis H. with fake documentation. No photos, no fingerprints, no trace of recent activity. But there was a teacup on the windowsill, still faintly stained, the remains of chamomile tea. Care flew to Lion, stood in the empty attic and looked out the window at the overgrown garden. I believe he let himself grow old here, she later told a colleague. And then he walked away, or perhaps he stayed quietly and passed. There was no grave, no body, no confirmation of identity. Only the hats. A strange legacy. Today, the majority of H's collection, what has been recovered, resides in the archives of the Glasgow Museum, under restricted access. The exhibit is not open to the public, but scholars and law enforcement specialists are occasionally granted viewings. Each hat sits in a simple glass box. Each card bears H's original notes. Some read like poetry. She had a laugh like dandelions. The bonnet was yellow. Others are haunting in their restraint. He wore this to every job interview. It never rained. Some seem entirely abstract. The rim curled like a thought. And a few are deeply personal. He wore this to his father's funeral, then never again. No one knows how H knew these details or if they were imagined, but the effect, repeated hundreds of times, is disarming, intimate, human. As one curator noted, it feels like walking through a collection of short stories, written not with words but with fabric and shape. Ripples in criminal study. H's crimes influenced more than one field. At the University of St. Andrews, a criminal psychology course devotes an entire module to symbolic criminal expression, using H as a case study. Students are asked not to analyze his behavior as pathological, but intentional as performance, as communication. In law enforcement, his methods were dissected for their subtlety. While his crimes were minor by statute, his ability to evade detection even from international agencies sparked reevaluations in counterespionage training. He became a kind of quiet legend in intelligence circles, not for what he did, but for how little he left behind. The human behind the hats. To this day, no one can confirm if Felix Hatherley was a real name, an alias, or even the sole person behind the hat thefts. Some believe he was a lone figure, retired from a defunct spy agency. Others think H became a persona, passed from one skilled operative to another, each continuing the pattern, the philosophy, the art. There's no proof. Only one clue has surfaced since 2006. In 2012, a hat was anonymously donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. No note, just the hat. It was a velvet bicorn, the kind worn by 18th century naval officers. Inside the brim, stitched in tiny black thread, were the words, "Silence is a kind of applause." No other connection was made, but the handwriting matched a prior note found in Rome. Kerr, now retired, believes that was H's final goodbye, a bow, a curtain call. When asked by a journalist if she ever wanted to catch him, she replied, "No, some mysteries don't need solving. Some are invitations to look more closely at the world. He stole hats, yes, but in doing so, he reminded us we were wearing them in the first place." And perhaps that was the point all along, not to escape justice, but to leave behind a question no one had thought to ask. What do we become when our symbols are removed? In 1925, Paris was a city of glittering facades and quiet desperation. The scars of the Great War still lingered in alleys and hospital wards. The economy teetered between cautious optimism and crushing debt. The boulevards bustled with fashion and art, but also rumor, suspicion, and opportunity. Into this environment stepped Victor Lustig, a man with the manners of a diplomat, the patience of a scholar, and the heart of a con artist. He didn't steal, He persuaded. He didn't threaten. He convinced. And one spring morning, in a private suite at the Hotel de Crillon overlooking the Champs-Élysées, he began the greatest con of his life. He sold the Eiffel Tower. Then 6 months later, he sold it again. The Count in his calling card. Victor Lustig was not a count. He was born in 1890 in Hostinay, a small town in Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic. His early life was comfortable, well-educated, and ordinary until he discovered that words could open doors locked to the honest. By the time he reached adulthood, Lustig spoke 5 languages fluently. He could mimic aristocratic airs or streetwise slang with equal ease. He wasn't flashy, but when he entered a room, he seemed to belong there. Always. He crisscrossed Europe running small-time cons, rigged horse races, fixed card games, fake investment schemes. But he was more than a swindler. He was a student of human need. A con man's greatest weapon, he once told a partner, is listening to what people want and giving them just enough to hope for it. In 1925, Lustig arrived in Paris under a new name, Count Victor Lustig, accompanied by a fake diplomatic passport, engraved calling cards, and an impeccable tailored suit. He checked into the Crillon and waited for inspiration. He found it in the morning paper. A national nuisance. The Eiffel Tower, just 36 years old at the time, was falling apart. Built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair, it had never been intended to stand indefinitely. The French public was divided. Some admired it, others loathed it. Newspapers called it an industrial monstrosity. Maintenance was expensive. Metal fatigue and rust plagued its frame. Then one article changed everything for Lustig. It was a short piece in Le Matin, noting that the government was struggling with the tower's upkeep and considering various radical solutions. It wasn't an announcement, just speculation. But to Lustig, it was opportunity. The letterhead of deception. Within a week, Lustig had created an official-looking letter from the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs, appointing him as a confidential representative tasked with a discreet mission to oversee the deconstruction and private sale of the Eiffel Tower for scrap. He rented a suite at the Crillon and sent personalized invitations to 5 of the largest scrap metal dealers in Paris. The letters were stamped with forged government seals and marked private and confidential. The language was bureaucratic, dry, believable. He scheduled private meetings. Each man was told the same story. Gentlemen, the Eiffel Tower has become an expensive liability. Due to political sensitivities, we are seeking a discreet buyer for its materials. This is a rare and lucrative opportunity requiring complete confidentiality. He handed out forged architectural documents and detailed blueprints, all smuggled from a legitimate government office where he'd bribed a junior clerk for access. He concluded the pitch with practiced restraint. We are not looking for a public spectacle. The buyer must be discreet. The funds must move quickly. You understand the nature of state affairs. He was betting on 3 things. The dealer's greed, their fear of missing out on a government contract, their reluctance to ask too many questions. He was right on all 3 counts. The mark André Poisson. Among the 5 dealers, one stood out, André Poisson. He was newer to the scrap game, less connected, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. Lustig played him perfectly. Over several private lunches, he let Poisson do most of the talking about his business, his dreams, his frustrations with being on the outside of the Parisian industrial elite. Lustig sympathized. Then, with careful timing, he confessed that as a low-level government official, he was expected to grease the wheels to ensure the deal went through. You understand, Monsieur Poisson, how politics work. A modest gratuity for facilitating the paperwork, it would go a long way toward making you our preferred buyer. Poisson, desperate not to lose the deal, agreed. Within days, Lustig had received a bribe, a down payment, and a farewell dinner in Poisson's honor. The next morning, Lustig boarded a train to Vienna. The aftermath and the silence. You might expect Poisson to have gone to the police. But he didn't. Why? Because the shame was overwhelming. He had paid a bribe to a man claiming to represent the French government. He had handed over real money based on false documents. Going to the authorities would expose him as both a victim and a participant in corruption. He stayed quiet. So did the other scrap dealers, who suspected something but had no evidence and were too embarrassed to speak out. Victor Lustig had done the impossible. He had sold the Eiffel Tower without lifting a finger or facing a charge. He could have disappeared, wealthy and anonymous. But Lustig was never content with enough. The second sale. Just 6 months later, he returned to Paris. Same hotel, same suite, new letterhead. He invited 5 different scrap dealers. Ran the same con, almost word for word. But this time, the man he selected as the mark was more suspicious. He reported the deal to the police, who began investigating before the money changed hands. Lustig vanished again, just days ahead of arrest. He fled to the United States, where a new chapter of crime awaited him. But the legend of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower not once, but twice would follow him for the rest of his life. A monument of human desire. When the story finally broke in European papers a year later, it was buried on page 6. The Eiffel Tower had not been dismantled. There was no real damage. But among con artists and law enforcement, the tale became a case study. Lustig didn't forge signatures, he forged reality. He identified a moment a sliver of doubt in public trust and slipped through it like silk. But how did he avoid capture for so long? And what did he do after fleeing Paris? Was this just the beginning of something bigger or the high point of his long deception? After slipping out of Paris for the second time, Victor Lustig landed in the one country large and loud enough for a man like him to disappear into: the United States. America in the 1920s was a con artist's playground. Prohibition was in full swing. Speakeasies thrived. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace with organized crime. Ambitious men in three-piece suits whispered promises of fortunes in oil, stocks, or foreign currencies. Greed was the national language, and Lustig spoke it fluently. But while most grifters chased quick scams, Victor was never interested in short games. He wanted more than money. He wanted control. And his next invention would give him exactly that. The Romanian box. To the untrained eye, it looked like a briefcase-sized mahogany box, polished, elegant, with brass fittings and 2 narrow paper slots. It was built to impress, and it did. Lustig called it the Romanian money box. The pitch was always the same. He would meet a potential mark, usually a wealthy businessman or politician, and confide that he had acquired a device developed in Romania during the war. A machine that could duplicate currency using rare chemical treatments and radio waves. It sounded absurd, and that was the genius. Because Lustig never tried to force belief, he invited doubt, played coy, gave just enough detail to intrigue, never enough to explain. When pressed, he'd demonstrate. He would place a genuine $100 bill into the first slot. Then slowly, he'd turn the hand crank, feed in a blank paper, and wait 6 hours. The next morning, in the presence of the mark, he would open the device and out would come a second identical $100 bill. Same serial number, same creases, same cent. The mark would be stunned. Of course, what the mark didn't know was that Lustig had preloaded the machine with duplicate bills. The blank paper had been a distraction. He'd sell the device for anywhere between $10,000 and $30,000. By the time the mark discovered it was fake after burning through genuine currency trying to duplicate, more the count was gone. 1,000 variations. Lustig didn't rely on brute force or sleight of hand. He built illusions, worlds. He adjusted his persona to fit each mark, sometimes a European scientist, other times a rogue inventor. He even claimed to be a deposed nobleman raising funds for a return to power. His skill was in mirroring the greed of his victims. "A man who wants something for nothing," he once wrote, "is a man I can give anything to." By the late 1920s, Lustig had reportedly sold over 40 Romanian boxes across the country. No two deals were the same. Sometimes he used a hotel suite, sometimes a train car. Once, he even set up shop inside a banker's office, claiming he needed a secure financial environment. Enemies on every side. But with every box sold, the walls closed in. Some victims were too proud to report the fraud, others weren't. By 1930, Lustig was wanted in multiple states under at least 45 aliases. He had passports from 6 countries, forged papers from embassies that didn't exist, and even letters of recommendation from former mayors, most of whom had never met him. He was charismatic, slippery, calm. But then he made a mistake. He went into business with Al Capone. The Capone Incident. In 1930, Lustig approached Capone with a curious proposition. He would double $50,000 in just 2 months using low-risk investments from Europe. Capone, skeptical but intrigued, handed over the cash but demanded no movement unless Lustig could prove legitimacy. Lustig never invested a cent. Instead, he placed the money in a safety deposit box. 2 months later, he returned to Capone with the exact $50,000, claiming the deal had fallen through but that he had protected the capital. Capone, surprised by the honesty, rewarded him with a $5,000 thank you. It was the con within the con. By losing nothing, Lustig had earned trust in cash. He had played the most dangerous man in America and walked away. The counterfeit escalation. By 1932, Lustig took his operations further. He began working with a chemist and a printing expert to manufacture counterfeit bills, mostly 50s and 100s. They were exquisite, near perfect, circulated slowly and strategically. He created a distribution ring, including traveling salesmen, bartenders, and even elevator operators, people who could slip a few bills into circulation without raising suspicion. The Secret Service caught wind. One of their lead agents, Peter A. Rubano, would later call Lustig the smoothest criminal mind we ever chased, a man who turned lies into art and crime into conversation. The woman in the bathrobe. In 1935, Lustig was living under the name Robert V. Miller in a New York City hotel. The Secret Service had narrowed in on him, but could never catch him with the counterfeit bills in hand. Their break came from an unlikely source, Lustig's girlfriend. Her name was Billie Mae, and she had grown jealous after discovering Lustig was seeing another woman. In a moment of vindictive fury, she called the Secret Service and told them where to find the engraving plates. Agents stormed the hotel and arrested him on the spot. But Lustig wasn't done. He had one last act: the escape. While awaiting trial at the Federal Detention Center in Manhattan, Lustig managed to escape. Wearing civilian clothes smuggled in by an accomplice, he fashioned a makeshift rope from bed linens, climbed out a window, and vanished into the streets. It took authorities 27 days to recapture him in Pittsburgh. He was sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz. During the trial, reporters asked how he had evaded authorities for so long. He reportedly smiled and said, "I had only one principle: always give the sucker an even break." The man who smiled through bars. In Alcatraz, Lustig was an exemplary prisoner. He read constantly, helped organize books in the prison library, mentored younger inmates on language and etiquette. To guards, he was polite and almost apologetic. He died in 1947 of pneumonia, officially listed as inmate number 300. He left behind no fortune, no real estate, no heirs, just one personal item, a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials VL. But in the margins of a Bible in his cell, someone found a quote, scrawled in fine ink. "I do not steal, I persuade, and if they are fooled, it is only because they were already lying to themselves." Was Victor Lustig a criminal or a philosopher of deception? Did he ever regret what he did, or was the con his true calling? And how many people, even today, are still chasing promises he never meant to keep? Victor Lustig spent the final years of his life behind the cold, damp walls of Alcatraz, America's most notorious prison. But his legend, crafted from charm, deception, and a masterful understanding of human nature, only grew larger with time. Though convicted as a counterfeiter, Lustig had done far more than pass fake bills. He had exposed the underbelly of trust itself. In an age obsessed with status, money, and power, he used illusions to steal what others gave away freely: belief. And he always did it with a smile. Life inside Alcatraz. Alcatraz wasn't kind to most. The Rock, as inmates called it, was designed for America's most incorrigible: murderers, mobsters, and men deemed too dangerous for other prisons. The cold air, constant surveillance, and psychological pressure were meant to break even the hardest souls. But Lustig, he adapted. He was not a violent man. He didn't swagger or posture. He greeted guards with politeness, addressed fellow inmates respectfully, and earned a quiet kind of respect. He rarely spoke of his past, though everyone knew who he was. In the prison library, he volunteered to catalog books. He studied philosophy and theology. He wrote letters always impeccably worded to distant contacts, never hinting at his old life but never quite denying it either. "Prison," he wrote in one letter, "is a place where men are measured not by what they've done, but by what they do now that they can do nothing." It was, perhaps, the closest he came to regret. Death of a con man. On March 11, 1947, Victor Lustig died of complications from pneumonia. He was 57 years old. His death certificate listed his occupation as apprentice salesman. He was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave, as per standard protocol for unclaimed bodies. No family visited. No friends claimed the body. No money was found in his accounts. And yet by then, the legend had taken root. An artist of the long con. Historians and criminologists would later debate the ethics of Lustig's crimes. He never used violence. He didn't steal from the poor. His targets were usually wealthy, ambitious, and complicit in their own deception. To many, he was less a criminal and more a mirror reflecting the greed, vanity, and desire of those around him. His playbook was studied by law enforcement not because of brute complexity, but because of psychological subtlety. He didn't outsmart systems. He outsmarted people. The 10 Commandments of the Con Man. Among the artifacts left behind from Lustig's arrest was a typewritten page. It was labeled simply, "The 10 Commandments for Con Men." Though never officially verified as his, the list is widely attributed to him. Be a patient listener. It is this, not fast talking, that gets a con man his coups. Never look bored. Wait for the other person to reveal any political opinions, then agree with them. Let the other person reveal religious views, then have the same ones. Hint at sex talk, but don't follow it up unless the other person shows strong interest. Never discuss illness unless the other person appears concerned. Never pry into personal circumstances, they'll tell you eventually. Never boast, just let your importance be quietly obvious. Never be untidy. Never get drunk. Each rule was crafted not to deceive, but to disarm. He built trust not by trickery, but by letting people see what they wanted to see. Echoes of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower scam, his most famous stunt, remains one of the boldest acts of psychological manipulation in criminal history. To sell a public monument with no ownership by forging government documents and renting hotel rooms. It required more than guts. It required an understanding of symbols. Lustig knew that the tower was more than steel. It was a mirror of national pride and bureaucratic indecision. He read between the lines of public frustration and offered a solution that felt both absurd and strangely possible. He didn't sell metal. He sold a moment of exclusive opportunity. That the scam worked twice wasn't just luck. It was social engineering at its finest. Influence on crime and culture. After Lustig's death, his story spread far beyond law enforcement. Magicians cited him as a master of misdirection. Spies studied his social manipulation techniques. Psychologists analyzed his ability to generate trust without proof. In 1963, a French crime novel, Le Voleur de la Tour, fictionalized his Eiffel Tower con. In 1982, the tale inspired a comedic interpretation in the film The Man Who Sold the World, and countless con artist characters from film noir to modern television owe their blueprint to him. Even now, in corporate boardrooms and political backrooms, the phrase "lustig logic" occasionally surfaces, a shorthand for convincing someone to believe what they already want to be true. The final illusion. Victor Lustig never left behind memoirs, no confessional book, no, as told to magazine interviews. He didn't trademark his techniques or defend his legacy. And that may have been his greatest con of all. Because what remains is not the man, but the idea of him. A man who stole nothing tangible, but everything meaningful. Who left behind no fortune, but inspired fascination for nearly a century. Who died behind bars but in stories, walks freely still. And so in the end we ask, was Victor Lustig a criminal genius or merely a mirror, held up to show us the elegant absurdity of our own illusions? In a small town outside Spokane, Washington, in the spring of 2008, a middle-aged woman named Alice Parker checked into a women's shelter using a quiet voice, a fake ID, and a tragic story. She said she had fled an abusive husband in Nevada. Her eyes welled up at just the right moment. She clutched a worn canvas bag with trembling fingers. She was fragile, likable, and most of all believable. The shelter gave her a bed, meals, and access to therapy. She was their newest intake. 6 weeks later, the shelter's director received a call from a social worker in Oregon. "We think you have someone we've been looking for," she said. Her name is Alice Parker. She used to go by Carolyn Wynn, and before that, well, a lot of names. That phone call would unravel a case that stretched across nearly 2 decades, 9 states, and 17 confirmed identities. This was no ordinary grifter. This was Ruth K. Wilder, a woman who had disappeared, reappeared, and shape-shifted her way through the cracks of the American social safety net with a kind of quiet genius. The first disappearance. In 1991, in Topeka, Kansas, a woman named Ruth Wilder walked out of her apartment one morning and never returned. She left behind an overdue rent notice, a landlord with questions, and a neighbor who said she'd seen Ruth acting strange the week before burning papers in her kitchen sink. There were no signs of foul play, no known enemies, no money in the bank, just a 25-year-old woman gone without a trace. The police noted it as a voluntary disappearance, not uncommon for young adults struggling to stay afloat. Her file was closed in 1993. But Ruth hadn't vanished. She had shed her skin. The art of becoming someone else. Ruth's secret wasn't high-tech. She didn't hack databases. She didn't create elaborate forged passports or foreign aliases. She did something simpler and much harder to detect. She became someone new. Every few years, she would move towns, usually to small or mid-sized cities. She'd change her name, dye her hair, adopt a new backstory, and slide quietly into the world of social programs. She often presented as a survivor of abuse or a woman fleeing religious persecution. In one case, she claimed to be a former nun. In another, an ex-cult member. In Utah, she told a shelter she had been raised in a polygamist compound. In Sacramento, she said she'd grown up in rural Alaska with no birth certificate. The stories were rich in detail, but vague on verifiables. They worked because they respected the boundaries of privacy. She never demanded attention, never pushed. She let others offer help. Once she had a new identity set, she would apply for housing assistance, get a job, usually in cleaning, caregiving, or admin, build low-profile relationships, keep to herself, slowly disappear again. Her trail only became visible years later, when overlapping data began to surface. How the truth emerged. The unraveling began not with a police report, but with a grant audit. In 2008, a nonprofit organization in Oregon underwent a federal audit of its shelter services program. While cross-checking intake forms and ID numbers, a data analyst noticed something strange. Two different clients, Carolyn Wynn and Tamara Keene, had listed nearly identical birth dates, childhood histories, and handwriting styles. Both had stayed at different shelters, 4 years apart, but submitted eerily similar intake essays describing a strict Pentecostal upbringing in Missouri. The analyst flagged it. A supervisor passed it on to a regional social services investigator. When they started digging, they found more names. Ellen Rhodes lived in Spokane in 2001, worked as a janitor. Teresa Lambert resided in Boise in 1998, received food assistance. Karen Heitwer enrolled in a domestic violence therapy group in Portland in 2005. Each identity seemed legitimate in isolation, but viewed together, they formed a network of disappearances and reinventions. The question was, why? The psychological puzzle. When social services alerted local law enforcement, a joint investigation quietly began. The FBI was eventually looped in not because of suspected terrorism or violence, but because of ID fraud across state lines. A behavioral analyst, Special Agent Lauren Hecht, was brought on. "We weren't looking at a con artist in the traditional sense," Hecht said in a later interview. "She wasn't stealing money. She wasn't living lavishly. She was living like a ghost with just enough to survive." Hecht believed Wilder's behavior wasn't rooted in profit but escape. Her theory: Ruth had experienced deep trauma in her early life, but instead of confronting it, she developed a coping mechanism of identity shedding. Reinvention became therapy. Moving became healing. "She wasn't just lying to the world," Hecht said. "She was trying to unbecome herself." A web of identities. By the time Alice Parker was flagged in Spokane, authorities had tied Wilder to 17 separate identities over 17 years. In each case, she had used a variation of her real birth year, always 1965-1968, claimed to be born in a rural area without hospital records, had no social media presence, avoided romantic entanglements, voluntarily left after 3 years in each location. In several instances, she even told new friends she might disappear one day. One former coworker remembered her saying, "Sometimes the wind changes and you just have to go." The confrontation. On July 2, 2008, authorities arranged a quiet intervention at the Spokane shelter. Rather than arrest her outright, they requested she come in to clarify some questions about her documentation. She agreed. In the interview room, they laid out 12 driver's licenses, a stack of social services records, and a single photo taken from her original 1991 apartment lease. She looked at it silently for a long time. Then, in a voice so soft it barely registered on the tape, she said, "I didn't want to be any of them. I just didn't want to be me." When asked if her real name was Ruth Wilder, she nodded. "That's the one I was born with," she said, "but I haven't worn it in years." What drove Ruth to such lengths to erase her identity? Was it trauma, cunning, or something stranger, a belief that one life simply wasn't enough? And in reinventing herself so many times, did she ever forget who she truly was? When Ruth Wilder was finally confronted in 2008, she didn't run. She didn't lie, she didn't deny. She simply said, "Okay." Investigators expected resistance. They expected evasion or panic. What they got was calm resignation, a woman who had known, perhaps for years, that her past would eventually find her. But that calm concealed an intricate network of vanished identities and forgotten places, and it would take federal agents more than a year to piece it together. The beginning, a family forgotten. When the FBI reopened the original 1991 disappearance file, they reached out to Ruth's family in Kansas. Only one relative responded, her younger sister, Marla Wilder. Marla hadn't heard from Ruth in over 17 years. When told her sister had been found, alive, and living under false names across the country, she didn't seem surprised. "She always said she wanted to disappear," Marla said. "Even when we were kids, she talked about becoming someone new." Their childhood had not been easy. Their father, a strict Pentecostal minister, reportedly enforced rigid behavioral codes. No television, no makeup, no secular books. Punishments were physical and frequent. According to Marla, Ruth was the rebellious one, curious, defiant, prone to disappearing for hours into the woods just to be alone. When Ruth turned 18, she left Topeka. She never returned. A pattern of escape. In 1991, Ruth had been working a clerical job at a dental office. She lived alone. She had no criminal record, no children, no known romantic ties. Then she vanished. Authorities now believe this was the first intentional disappearance, the dry run for what would become a lifelong pattern. Her next identity appeared 6 months later in Denver under the name Rachel Klein. Each new name came with a small bag of clothing, a vague story of hardship, and a fresh set of handwritten forms filled out with near-perfect consistency. Left-handed, clean cursive, always listing childhood towns with names like Hope, Benton, or Calvary, places that didn't exist. It was as if she was writing her own mythology. No profit, no paper trail. Despite crossing state lines and using false IDs, Ruth had never applied for credit, never filed taxes, and never opened a traditional bank account under any of her aliases. She lived entirely in cash, barter, and under-the-table jobs, housekeeping, elderly care, night shifts at small diners. The FBI's financial forensics report noted, subject appeared to avoid technology or long-term attachments by design. She moved before any digital footprint could be established. Her movements resemble not those of a fraudster, but of a person engaged in long-term evasion of self. This puzzled prosecutors. Why go to such great lengths without gaining anything tangible? She never owned property, never built savings, never posed as someone rich or powerful. She simply survived. The journal in the storage locker. One of the most revealing discoveries came from a storage locker in Salem, Oregon, rented under the name Diana Lore. Inside was a small collection of books, clothing, and a weathered composition notebook. The entries were sparse, dated only by month and year. They read more like fragmented thoughts than diary entries. May 2003, the people here believe I came from Utah. That story feels like someone else's now. Jan 2005. I saw a woman with a red scarf just like the one I had in Kansas. Froze me in the street. June 2006. Tried to remember my mother's voice. Couldn't. Aug 2007. I'm scared the names are becoming real. I answer to them too quickly. What emerges from the journal is not a master manipulator, but a fractured identity. Someone slowly being consumed by the lies they lived within. Not deceit, dissociation. The psychological evaluation. After her arrest, Ruth was placed under psychiatric evaluation before trial. Dr. Melanie Rowe, a forensic psychologist assigned to the case, testified that Ruth did not meet the clinical criteria for dissociative identity disorder, nor for sociopathy or delusional psychosis. Instead, she was diagnosed with complex PTSD and maladaptive identity formation. She did not believe she was these people, Dr. Rowe explained, but she also didn't feel she had a self-worth returning to. So she borrowed lives like coats worn until they frayed, then discarded. It's an unsettling idea that someone could learn to survive not through violence or theft, but by becoming what was needed to be safe, unnoticed, unchallenged. She was a mirror to the system she passed through. Testimonies from the forgotten. As Ruth's case made quiet legal rounds, investigators tracked down former acquaintances from her various identities. What they found was striking. In Boise, she had worked as a nursing aide and was remembered as gentle and attentive. In Sacramento, she volunteered to tutor GED students in math. In Salem, she attended a Unitarian church, always sitting in the back row. None of her acquaintances suspected she was anyone other than who she said she was. She kept to herself, said one former coworker, but she was kind, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who left a sandwich for you in the fridge with a note. One woman recalled Ruth saying, "I just want to be the kind of person someone would miss, but not too much." Legal fallout or lack thereof. Ruth was ultimately charged with identity fraud, false statements, and interstate use of fraudulent documentation. But her case presented a dilemma. She hadn't stolen Social Security numbers. She hadn't impersonated real people. She had created identities from scratch, always staying under the radar. Her crimes weren't driven by greed. They were quiet, cumulative violations of paper and process hard to define, harder to punish. In a surprising turn, the U.S. Attorney's Office negotiated a deal. A 5-year suspended sentence and mandatory psychiatric care under supervised housing. It wasn't leniency. It was recognition of the legal grayness she occupied. Ruth accepted the terms without protest. She told the court, "I never meant to hurt anyone. I just didn't know how to stay in one place without feeling like I was vanishing." But who was Ruth, really? A victim of her past, or a willing architect of a fragmented life? And what does her story say about how easy it is to disappear without anyone asking where you've gone? The court was quiet the day Ruth Wilder stood before the judge. No media presence, no cameras, no sensation. Her case was not grand enough for headlines. She hadn't stolen millions. She hadn't endangered lives. She had simply taken names, stories, and scraps of trust 17 times over. Yet in its own way, her life posed a more haunting question than the boldest heist. What does it mean when someone chooses, again and again, to erase themselves? Life under watch. After her suspended sentence in 2009, Ruth was placed in supervised housing in Portland, Oregon. A caseworker visited weekly. She attended mandatory therapy sessions and group counseling for trauma survivors. She was 43 years old, but she seemed older. Her posture stooped, her hair streaked with gray, her voice faint. The structure seemed to help at first. She took a part-time job at a thrift store. She joined a knitting circle at the local library. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she lived under her real name. But there were cracks. Her therapist, Dr. Rowe, later wrote, she struggled with permanence. Signing her real name on forms caused visible distress. She often described it as wearing clothes that no longer fit. On more than one occasion, she slipped and introduced herself to strangers with a false name, then quickly corrected herself. The identities, it seemed, were not masks she had worn. They had worn into her. The names she remembered. As part of her therapy, Ruth was asked to list all the names she had used. She could recall 14 of the 17. Some she spoke aloud with a trace of fondness, like old friends. Teresa Lambert, she was the one who liked gardening. Corinne Heitwer, she always wore red. Ellen Rhodes, she was tired but people trusted her. Others she barely remembered at all. Diana Lore, she feels like a stranger. I don't know what she did. When asked if she had ever lost track of who she really was, Ruth paused for nearly a full minute before answering. I think Ruth got lost in the middle of it all. Sometimes I thought she was the lie. The community that didn't notice. During her years of reinvention, Ruth lived among ordinary people, teachers, cashiers, pastors, single mothers, truck drivers. None of them suspected her. Why? Because she was never dangerous, never demanding, never loud. She was the woman in the corner seat of the bus, the coworker who quietly did her job, the neighbor who waved politely but kept her blinds drawn. Invisible by choice. One former employer told the truth after her arrest, simply shook his head. She worked here for 2 years, never late, never caused trouble. If she wanted to be someone else, well, I guess that was her business. It raised an uncomfortable thought. How many people pass through our lives unnoticed, wearing names that aren't theirs because we never bother to ask? The quiet disappearance again. In 2014, after completing her supervised release, Ruth was officially free. No more check-ins, no restrictions. She lived for a time in subsidized housing under her real name. She held on to her job at the thrift store. She attended church occasionally. Then, one morning in September 2016, her caseworker arrived for a scheduled visit. The apartment was empty. The closet held only a few hangers. The dresser drawers were bare. The knitting bag was gone. On the kitchen counter sat a handwritten note, folded neatly. It read, I tried to stay, I truly did, but the silence of old names is louder than any present one. Thank you for holding me this long. Don't follow, R. No trace of her has ever been found. A ghost in the records. The FBI closed her case in 2018, labeling her a voluntary disappearance again. To this day, there are no confirmed sightings. But scattered rumors persist. A woman named Anna in Colorado Springs, working as a caregiver, who vanished after 2 years. A Mary Jo in Idaho Falls, living in a trailer park, described by neighbors as soft-spoken and private. A Clara in Reno, who attended an abuse survivors group for 6 months before suddenly moving on. None of these identities could be confirmed, but investigators suspect Ruth returned to the only survival mechanism she knew, erasing herself. The reflection she leaves behind. Ruth Wilder's story is not one of riches or power. She was not a master thief or a grand manipulator. She was something stranger, a woman who used the cracks of compassion as her hiding place. Every shelter, every social worker, every community that took her in did so out of kindness. She didn't exploit them for wealth. She simply borrowed enough identity to keep going. But in doing so, she exposed a system that is both generous and vulnerable. As one investigator put it, she showed us that the easiest way to disappear isn't to break the rules, it's to live quietly inside them, until no one remembers to ask who you were. The question that remains, was Ruth Wilder a criminal? Legally, yes. She forged documents. She lied on government forms. She crossed state lines under false names. But was she dangerous, exploitative, malicious? The record suggests otherwise. Instead, she remains a symbol of something far more unsettling: how fragile the idea of identity really is. A name, a story, a face, these are not fixed. They can be swapped, softened, erased. And if someone does it long enough, perhaps even they forget where the mask ends and the skin begins. In the end, Ruth Wilder may have succeeded at what she tried to do all along. She didn't just vanish once. She vanished 17 times, and maybe this last time for good. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary gas station. Concrete pumps, fluorescent lights buzzing against the night sky, a dingy convenience store with stale coffee, a few racks of candy bars, and dusty lottery tickets behind the counter. It was the kind of place you barely noticed while filling your tank. But in Staten Island, New York, in the late 1980s, one unremarkable gas station became the beating heart of a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme, a criminal operation so audacious, and yet so mundane that it would take federal investigators years to uncover. The secret wasn't hidden in a back room or buried under the floor. It was in plain sight. The crime was built on gasoline itself. The world of fuel laundering. To understand how a small gas station could wash millions in illicit funds, you have to understand a peculiar loophole in American taxation. In the 1980s, federal and state governments introduced excise taxes on gasoline, special per-gallon charges that distributors had to pay before the fuel hit the pumps. These taxes could amount to 10 to 30 cents per gallon, depending on the state. For ordinary drivers, that tax was folded into the price at the pump. But for criminals, it was an opportunity. If you could avoid paying the excise tax and still charge customers as if you could pocket the difference. And if you could launder money through that system, you had a nearly invisible mechanism to wash dirty cash into clean profits. This became known in law enforcement circles as the gasoline bootlegging racket. And it was enormous. By some estimates, the scheme drained over $1 billion in unpaid fuel taxes nationwide between 1982 and 1992. At its center were small, ordinary gas stations like the one on Staten Island. The owners who were never there. The station was registered under a shell company, with a rotating cast of owners who appeared on paperwork but never once stood behind the counter. 1 month, the station was owned by North Shore Petroleum, Inc. 6 months later, it was owned by Bayfront Fuel Distributors, LLC. Each new company had no real office, no employees, no assets beyond a stack of forms filed with the state. These companies were known as burn companies, entities designed to collect revenue for a short time, then vanish before the government came asking for taxes. By the time tax collectors noticed the missing funds, the company was dissolved, its records gone, and a new one already in place. The gas station itself never closed. Pumps kept flowing. Customers kept filling their tanks. To the public, nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, though, millions in taxes were disappearing. The flow of dirty money. The Staten Island station became more than just a tax dodge. It became a money laundering hub. Organized crime groups, particularly factions tied to the Gambino and Genovese families, needed ways to wash proceeds from drug trafficking, loan sharking, and extortion. Cash piled up faster than it could be moved. Gasoline provided the perfect cover. Here how it worked. Dirty cash was delivered in bulk duffel bags stuffed with small bills. The station's books were padded, recording inflated sales of gasoline that never actually pumped. The dirty money was blended into the station's reported revenue. On paper, every dollar looked like it came from legitimate fuel sales. Because gas stations dealt in huge volumes of cash daily, No one blinked when hundreds of thousands of dollars flowed through their accounts. The IRS saw only fuel sales, the public saw only gas pumps, and the mob saw rivers of clean money. Whispers on the street. For years, the Staten Island station operated in obscurity. But neighbors noticed odd patterns. The pumps always seemed busy on paper, yet the station itself was half empty. New managers appeared frequently, but none lasted long. The convenience store barely restocked. One nearby resident recalled, "It was the kind of place where you filled your car and left fast. Nobody lingered. It didn't feel like a normal station." Drivers might have thought it was just poorly run. In reality, the gas itself was almost a side business. The paperwork was the product. The investigators' first clues. The scheme might have continued indefinitely, if not for an accountant named Michael DiMarco, who worked at a mid-sized fuel distribution company in New Jersey. DiMarco noticed that one of his clients, the Staten Island station, was consistently ordering tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline every week, but paying suspiciously low taxes. He flagged it to his supervisor, who quietly tipped off investigators at the New York State Department of Taxation. That tip landed on the desk of Special Agent Gerald Finneran, a man who had been tracking fuel tax fraud for years. Finneran knew what he was looking at. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping, he later said. It was a ghost company, and ghosts don't pay taxes. A hidden empire. When Finneran pulled records, he found a chain of at least 30 shell companies linked by the same mailing address, a small P.O. box in Brooklyn. Each company had owned the Staten Island station for a short period. Each disappeared without paying its taxes. But the money flowing through their accounts didn't vanish. It had been rerouted to offshore banks, real estate purchases, and luxury imports. By conservative estimates, the station laundered over $15 million in just 5 years. And that was only one location. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized this wasn't a lone racket. It was part of a national network of fuel laundering, stretching from New York to Florida to California. The Staten Island station was just a node. The sting operation. In 1989, Finneran and his team launched an undercover investigation. Agents posed as fuel distributors, offering to sell gasoline at discounted rates without proper tax stamps. They arranged meetings with middlemen connected to the station. What they found confirmed their suspicions. The mob was skimming millions in unpaid fuel taxes and using gas stations to wash criminal proceeds. One taped conversation captured a mob associate bragging, "It's better than heroin. You sell gas, everybody wants it, nobody dies, and the government can't even keep track." For the first time, prosecutors saw a path to dismantle the racket. But catching the people behind it would not be easy. How did investigators finally bring down the scheme? Who really controlled the Staten Island station, and how far did the fuel racket reach? By 1989, Special Agent Gerald Finneran and his team had gathered enough fragments of evidence to see the outline of something much larger than a shady Staten Island station. What they didn't yet know was how far the tendrils reached, or who was really pulling the strings. The answer would take them through a maze of shell corporations, mob intermediaries, and international banks. And along the way, they would discover just how profitable the business of selling nothing could be. The fragile shells. Every time investigators subpoenaed one of the companies tied to the Staten Island station, they found the same thing. No employees. No office. A few hastily prepared ledgers. A corporate officer who couldn't be located. They were burn companies, designed to collapse under scrutiny. One called Bayfront Fuel Distributors had listed a president named Anthony Russo. When investigators tracked him down, They found a man in Florida who had no idea his name was being used. His identity had been stolen, his signature forged. Another, North Shore Petroleum, dissolved just 2 weeks before its tax bill came due, leaving behind $2.4 million in unpaid excise taxes. By the time authorities filed collection notices, the company no longer existed. And yet the gas station remained open. New paperwork, new company, same pumps. The operation wasn't sloppy. It was elegant in its simplicity. The gasoline cartel. As the investigation widened, Finneran realized the Staten Island racket was only a single spoke in a national wheel. From New York to New Jersey, from Miami to Chicago, similar schemes were appearing. Gas stations reporting inflated sales. Shell companies dissolving overnight. Millions in excise taxes unpaid. The IRS estimated the loss at nearly $1 billion nationwide. Law enforcement began referring to it as the gasoline cartel, a loose, decentralized network of organized crime families who had discovered that fuel taxes were easier to steal than drugs, less violent than gambling, and far more profitable than loan sharking. In some cases, mafia families that had once fought over narcotics and construction rackets were now collaborating, sharing distributors, laundering routes, and even legal counsel. The middlemen. The Staten Island station itself was run by low-level managers, men who pumped gas, sold cigarettes, and knew better than to ask questions. But above them were the middlemen, crucial links between the street-level station and the higher echelons of organized crime. Investigators identified two of them. Salvatore "Sally Pumps" Gaddy, a quiet operator known for moving between fuel wholesalers, arranging shipments that never quite matched the invoices. Michael "Mick" Petrelli, a mid-level Gambino associate with connections to trucking unions. These men weren't flashy, they weren't violent, but they were essential. They handled the paperwork, bribed inspectors, and kept the pumps running smoothly. When agents placed them under surveillance, they noticed a peculiar routine: weekly visits from men in suits who never touched the pumps, never entered the store, but always left with envelopes. The breakthrough: paper over gas. The key insight came when investigators realized they didn't need to follow the gasoline at all. They needed to follow the paperwork. Every gallon of fuel was tracked by invoices, tax stamps, and receipts, but the Staten Island records were riddled with contradictions. Deliveries listed that never arrived. Trucks that supposedly moved 40,000 gallons in a single day, more than they could physically carry. Invoices with identical handwriting, but different company names. Finneran later described it as, "They weren't moving fuel, they were moving fiction. The money flowed because the paper said it did." By reconstructing these paper trails, the team could prove a pattern of fraud even if the gas itself was long gone. The undercover deal. To nail down evidence, the FBI sent in an undercover agent posing as a crooked distributor willing to sell untaxed fuel. The Staten Island crew bit immediately. They arranged to buy 100,000 gallons at a discounted rate, paying in cash. The undercover agent delivered doctored invoices showing the taxes had been paid when in reality, no taxes ever moved. The meeting was taped. On the recording, Sally Pumps laughed and said, "This is the gravy right here. No heat, no guns, just pumps and paper." It was the moment investigators needed. The mob's silent goldmine. As agents dug deeper, they uncovered just how critical the fuel racket had become to the mob. Traditional rackets, gambling, extortion, loan sharking, were profitable but volatile. Drug trafficking carried massive legal risks. Fuel fraud, by contrast, was almost invisible. Everyone needed gasoline. Everyone paid at the pump without thinking. and the amounts were so vast that siphoning a few cents per gallon could yield millions in weeks. One mob accountant, later turned informant, described it as the perfect crime. You don't rob the bank, you make the bank send you checks every month. The raid. In 1992, after years of surveillance, the FBI and IRS moved in. The Staten Island gas station was raided at dawn. Agents seized ledgers, invoices, and stacks of cash hidden in soda crates. Several managers were arrested on the spot. Simultaneous raids hit fuel depots in Brooklyn, New Jersey, and Florida. Dozens of indictments followed, targeting both middlemen and higher-level mafia figures. Prosecutors estimated the Staten Island station alone had laundered more than $15 million and funneled a significant portion directly into mob coffers. The fallout. The trials stretched for years. Some middlemen flipped, offering testimony in exchange for lighter sentences. Others vanished before they could be subpoenaed. A handful of mob bosses faced federal racketeering charges, but many escaped conviction. The paper trails were convoluted, the shell companies dissolved, the records conveniently missing. Still, the raids dealt a blow to the gasoline cartel. The Staten Island hub was permanently shut down. But investigators admitted, even then, that the racket wasn't dead. You can't shut off the pumps everywhere, one IRS official said. You just slow the flow. But did the crackdown really end the fuel racket? Or did it simply evolve into newer, subtler schemes? And what does it say about crime when the most profitable scams are hidden in the ordinary things we use every day? When the Staten Island gas station finally closed its doors in 1992, it didn't look like the end of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. It looked like what it had always pretended to be: a small, failing business, another boarded-up relic on a gray New York street. But to the men and women who had spent years untangling its records, it represented something much larger: proof that the most profitable crimes can hide in plain sight. The courtroom battles. The federal trials stretched across the early 1990s. Prosecutors charged managers, distributors, and mob associates under a combination of tax evasion, racketeering, and conspiracy statutes. One of the most high-profile indictments named Michael "Mick" Petrelli, the Gambino associate caught in undercover tapes negotiating untaxed fuel deals. He was sentenced to 12 years. Salvatore "Sally Pumps" Gaddy, less cooperative, took his case to trial. Jurors heard recordings of him boasting about gravy money from the pumps. He received 15 years. But when it came to the higher-level boss's men, with ties to the Genovese and Gambino families, the cases faltered. Witnesses recanted. Paper trails blurred. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had legitimate interests in fuel distribution and could not be tied directly to the shell companies. Some bosses walked free. Others received light sentences on lesser charges. It was a frustrating pattern, as one prosecutor admitted. "We caught the men at the pumps. The ones at the top just turned off the lights and moved on." The aftermath for the community. For Staten Island residents, the station's closure barely registered. A new operator eventually reopened the lot under legitimate ownership. But some locals remembered the strange years when the pumps never seemed busy, yet the station never went out of business. One retired detective recalled, "That was the lesson. The mob didn't need to shoot anyone or run numbers or shake down bars. They could run a gas station, file fake invoices, and steal millions. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared." The public never connected the dots. The scandal faded behind louder headlines: murders, drug busts, political corruption. But quietly, the case left its mark on how investigators approached boring businesses. The broader network. The Staten Island case was just one piece of a vast puzzle. In the years that followed, federal investigations revealed fuel laundering operations in Florida, New Jersey, and California. Each used the same template. Create shell companies. Avoid excise taxes. Dissolve before collection. Funnel money through offshore accounts. At its height, the gasoline cartel was estimated to have drained over $10 billion nationwide in unpaid taxes and laundered funds. It wasn't just Italian-American organized crime. Russian and Eastern European groups adopted the model. In Florida, Cuban exile networks joined the trade. In Los Angeles, Armenian groups experimented with it. Fuel had become the perfect criminal commodity, legal, necessary, and nearly impossible to track in bulk. The lessons learned. By the mid-1990s, federal and state governments responded. Electronic tracking systems were introduced to monitor wholesale fuel distribution. Excise taxes were shifted from distributors to refineries, cutting out shell companies. Multi-agency task forces were formed to specifically target excise tax evasion schemes. These reforms slowed the racket but never erased it. Even in the 2000s, scattered cases appeared smaller, less centralized, but built on the same model. The crime didn't die, one IRS investigator said. It just got quieter. The psychology of invisible crime. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the Staten Island case wasn't the money stolen, it was how little it disrupted the lives of ordinary people. The gas station sold fuel, the pumps worked, customers paid what they expected to pay. Nobody felt robbed. Unlike burglary or fraud, there was no direct victim to file a report. The losses came from tax revenue abstract, distant, hidden in government budgets. And yet the consequences were real. Schools went underfunded, roads deteriorated, hospitals stretched their resources thinner. Every gallon of gas they sold without paying taxes, said Special Agent Finneran, was money stolen from every taxpayer who thought they were doing their part. It was crime without drama, and that made it all the more dangerous. The long shadow. For years after, rumors persisted that the mob continued to profit from fuel rackets in subtler ways through trucking unions, distribution contracts, and offshore refineries. In 1999, a congressional report cited the gasoline bootlegging scheme as one of the most damaging organized crime operations of the 20th century. Yet most Americans had never heard of it. The Staten Island station was just one node, but it symbolized the entire operation, ordinary on the outside, extraordinary in its hidden design. The reflection. When asked years later what the case taught him, Agent Finneran said, "We spend so much time chasing the loud crimes, the drugs, the guns, the murders. But the quiet crimes, the boring ones, those are the ones that bleed us slow. Nobody sees them coming. Nobody believes they matter. And that's why the criminals love them." So we're left with a question that lingers like the smell of gasoline at a pump. If the most lucrative crimes are the ones no one notices, how many more are happening right now, beneath the glow of ordinary neon signs? It was supposed to be just another night shift. In Cleveland, Ohio, in 2013, a janitor named Henry Wallace reported to work at the old Franklin County Records building, a drafty structure of yellow brick and rattling pipes. By then, the building was more storage than office rows of dusty boxes, faded binders, and filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. Henry was used to the monotony: mop the halls, empty the bins, keep the place decent enough for the handful of clerks who still came in during the day. But that evening, while clearing out a basement storeroom scheduled for renovation, he noticed something strange: a false panel in the wall, loose enough to shift with a broom handle. Behind it was a narrow recess. Inside, a stack of folders wrapped in string, stained with water damage. When he flipped one open, he saw a word stamped in red ink: homicide, and beneath it, 1979. Henry didn't know it then, but he had just stumbled upon the long-buried trail of one of Cleveland's strangest cold cases, a murder no one had solved, hidden for more than 30 years. The Forgotten Murder. The file concerned a man named Daniel Harper, age 41, found dead in July 1979 along the banks of the Cuyahoga River. Harper had been a mid-level accountant at a steel manufacturing firm. He lived alone in a small apartment, kept to himself, and had no known enemies. His body was discovered by fishermen early one morning, his skull fractured, his wallet missing. The homicide squad had investigated at the time but found little. No witnesses, no clear motive, no suspects ever charged. The case went cold within a year. So why had the file disappeared into a wall? The janitor's call. Henry didn't take the files home. He did what most wouldn't. He called the police. At first, the responding officers assumed it was nothing unusual. Old buildings had misplaced documents all the time. But when they saw the red homicide stamp, they forwarded the material to the Cleveland Cold Case Unit. Detective Marissa Cole, a meticulous investigator with a reputation for obsessing over details, took the file home that night. She read it twice. Something about the case nagged at her. Why would an ordinary accountant end up beaten to death by a river? And why had the records been hidden? The 1979 investigation. The original detectives had noted that Harper had been last seen leaving his office late on a Friday night. He was carrying a briefcase. Witnesses said he looked agitated. The briefcase was never recovered. Police had considered robbery, but the file suggested something more deliberate. Harper had multiple bruises, suggesting a prolonged struggle. His apartment had been searched after the murder, though nothing of value appeared missing. The killer, it seemed, had been looking for something. But what? The company connection. Harper's employer, Midwest Steel and Supply, had folded in the late 1980s. But in 1979, it was one of the city's larger manufacturers, employing thousands. The case file contained one curious note. Harper had been preparing to meet with federal auditors regarding discrepancies in the company's financial records. He had confided to a colleague that he believed something crooked was happening in the books. That meeting never took place. Detective Cole circled that line 3 times. Revisiting old witnesses. Cole tracked down Harper's surviving relatives, 2 nieces living in Michigan. They remembered him as quiet, private, but meticulous. One recalled visiting his apartment as a child and being told, "Uncle Dan keeps everything written down. If you ever want the truth, check his notebooks." But none of those notebooks were in the police file. Nor were they found in the apartment inventory from 1979. Another gap, another missing piece. The whistleblower angle. Digging into federal archives, Cole found that Midwest Steel had indeed been under investigation in the late 1970s. Several executives were suspected of embezzlement and tax fraud. But the inquiry fizzled. Records showed lack of cooperating witnesses and insufficient documentation. Cole began to wonder, had Harper been that witness? If he had uncovered financial misconduct, he may have been silenced before he could speak. And perhaps someone within the system had buried the evidence literally by sealing the file behind a wall. The missing detective. The 1979 case had been assigned to Detective Harold Briggs, a veteran of the Homicide Division. Briggs had retired in 1982 and passed away in 1998. He left behind no family, no memoirs, but his personnel file noted a reprimand, failure to properly file case evidence in at least 3 investigations. Was it negligence or something more deliberate? One entry in the hidden file suggested the latter. On the last page of the case summary, written in faded pencil, was a note. Check payroll slips, don't trust HQ. Cole stared at the handwriting. It didn't look like Briggs, who had written it. The payroll clue. Cole requested payroll records from Midwest Steel, now archived at a local historical society. The ledgers revealed something startling. In 1978-79, the company had paid out thousands of dollars in wages to employees who didn't exist. Fake names, fake hours, ghost workers. It was classic payroll fraud, a scheme to siphon money quietly from company funds. And Daniel Harper, the accountant, would have been in the perfect position to spot it. The shadow of the river. With this new context, Harper's murder took on a different shape. He discovers the payroll fraud. He plans to disclose it to federal auditors. Before he can, he disappears with his briefcase. His body turns up by the river. The investigation goes cold. And the file, hidden, until a janitor's mop handle knocked it free. Who silenced Daniel Harper? Was it corrupt executives, a mob-connected enforcer, or even a fellow detective steering the case away from the truth? Detective Marissa Cole could not shake the feeling that Daniel Harper's briefcase, the one that vanished with him in 1979, was the key to everything. The payroll fraud was obvious now, but what had Harper written down? What had he collected? And who had been desperate enough to kill him to keep it hidden? The more she followed the paper trail, the more she realized the crime was bigger than one dead accountant. The ghost payroll. The ledgers Cole found at the Historical Society showed dozens of employees with fabricated names. Frank Dole, 40 hours a week, steady paychecks. Susan Teller, occasional overtime. Listed address didn't exist. Anthony Rossi, paid for 3 years, but no social security record. Each worker represented thousands of dollars funneled out of Midwest Steel and into someone's pocket. Cole estimated that between 1977 and 1979, the scheme diverted more than $2 million, a staggering figure for the time. Whoever controlled it had both money and motive to silence Harper. The mob connection. Cleveland in the 1970s was not immune to mob influence. The city's unions, trucking companies, and steel contracts all had ties to organized crime families from Chicago and Detroit. Payroll fraud was a classic tactic. Inflate the books, siphon the money, and kick back a portion to mob enforcers for protection. Cole wondered, had Harper stumbled onto mob skimming? She reached out to retired FBI agent Paul Haskins, who had worked organized crime in Cleveland in the late 70s. When she showed him the payroll records, he nodded grimly. We suspected ghost workers back then, but we couldn't prove it. Every time we pushed, files disappeared, witnesses clammed up, or cases got buried. He looked at Harper's photo, then shook his head. If he was about to talk, he wouldn't have lasted long. The missing briefcase. The one detail everyone returned to was the missing briefcase. Witnesses said Harper carried it everywhere. His landlord told police he had left for work that Friday with the case in hand. But when his body was found by the river, it was gone. What was inside? Payroll slips, personal notes, a whistleblower statement for the federal auditors. Detective Briggs's old handwritten note, check payroll slips, don't trust HQ, suggested he had at least glimpsed Harper's evidence. So why had Briggs buried the file instead of pursuing it? The cop who knew too much. Cole dug deeper into Briggs's career. Personnel reviews described him as a competent detective, if sometimes careless with paperwork. But one internal affairs report, filed quietly in 1980, caught her eye. Briggs had been investigated for associating with known mob-linked businessmen at a downtown bar. The inquiry went nowhere, and Briggs retired 2 years later. Had he been compromised? Or had he been pressured to drop Harper's case and hidden the file as a way of preserving what little evidence he could. The truth was murky. Briggs was long dead, his motives unknowable. But Cole leaned toward a darker theory. Someone had leaned on him to bury Harper's file. A visit to the river. Cole visited the site where Harper's body had been found. The banks of the Cuyahoga had changed in 34 years, but old maps placed the location near an abandoned dock once used by steel barges. Locals remembered the area as a frequent mob dumping ground. A retired dockworker told her, "Back then you didn't ask questions. Sometimes you'd see cars parked late at night, guys carrying something heavy. You just kept walking." Harper's body hadn't been weighted down. Whoever killed him wanted him found, just not his briefcase. The nephew's memory. Cole tracked down Harper's nephew, now in his 50s. He remembered visiting his uncle in the summer of 1979, a few weeks before the murder. One night, Harper had taken him aside and said something odd. "If anything happens to me, look in the green ledger." The nephew didn't know what that meant. No green ledger had been found in Harper's apartment. But it was the first clue suggesting Harper had tried to safeguard his evidence. The storage locker. Through property records, Cole discovered Harper had rented a small storage locker under his own name in 1978. The unit had been closed decades earlier, its contents auctioned off. But when she tracked down the facility manager, an elderly man named Clarence, he remembered something strange. "That unit sat empty for years, but I swear nobody ever bid on it. When we cleaned it out, there wasn't much, just old office boxes. I think we tossed them." Cole's heart sank. Had the green ledger been lost to a dumpster 30 years ago? Or had someone else retrieved it long before? The accountant's circle. Harper hadn't been completely alone. His colleague, Margaret Price, was still alive at 86 and living in a retirement home. When Cole visited, Margaret recalled Harper as a serious man, almost too serious. She remembered the week before his death vividly. "He told me, 'Margaret, there are ghosts on these payrolls. I can't keep signing off.' He was worried, said he might go to the feds." Did Harper confide in anyone else? Margaret shook her head. He wasn't the type to share, but he kept everything written down. If they killed him, it's because of those papers. The Cold Case Committee. By late 2014, Cole had enough to reopen the case officially. The Cleveland Cold Case Committee, a joint effort of local police, state investigators, and the FBI, reviewed her findings. Their consensus: Harper had been killed because he uncovered payroll fraud linked to organized crime. But without the briefcase or ledger, there was no smoking gun. The case remained technically unsolved. So where did Harper's green ledger go? Was it destroyed, hidden, or buried with someone else's secrets? And why did a single janitor's discovery nearly 35 years later feel like the only reason the truth surfaced at all? By the time Detective Marissa Cole had exhausted the trail, Daniel Harper's murder was 35 years old. Witnesses were gone, companies dissolved, records decayed in basements or vanished into dumpsters. And yet, thanks to a janitor's broom handle, the case had stirred again like dust shaken loose from a forgotten corner. The final leads. In 2015, Cole received a tip from an archivist who had been combing through bankruptcy filings related to Midwest Steel. Among them was a box mislabeled 1976 pension. Inside, she found a folder marked Payroll Adjustments, 1978-79. The documents were copies, not originals, but they showed the same ghost employees Harper had flagged. In the margins, faint pencil notes appeared. The handwriting matched samples from Harper's apartment inventory. He had annotated the payroll sheets himself. It wasn't the green ledger, but it proved Harper had documented the fraud. And it gave prosecutors in the Cold Case Committee just enough to confirm what Cole already knew. Harper had been silenced for uncovering a racket that siphoned millions. The suspects who vanished. Two executives from Midwest Steel, identified in the old federal files as persons of interest, had died years earlier, both with reputations for mob ties, both never formally charged. A former union official, still alive but in his 90s, refused interviews. His lawyer issued a statement. "My client has no recollection of events from 35 years ago and categorically denies any wrongdoing." No usable suspects remained. The case was declared administratively closed. Not solved, not forgotten, simply closed. The janitor's reflection. Henry Wallace, the janitor who had found the hidden file, was invited to a small ceremony at the Cleveland Police Headquarters when the case was officially updated. Reporters asked him what he thought. He shrugged. "I was just doing my job, mopping floors. I didn't solve anything. I just found what someone else tried to hide." And yet, in a way, his discovery had given Harper something he had been denied: acknowledgement. The family's response. Harper's nieces attended the same ceremony. One of them, visibly emotional, told the gathered detectives, "All our lives, Uncle Dan was just a question mark. We thought maybe he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. To know he stood up against something bigger, that he wasn't just a victim, but a man trying to do the right thing that matters." For them, the case was never about arrests. It was about dignity. The discovery of the payroll records and Harper's notes restored a measure of that. The system's blind spot. The Harper case became a teaching tool within law enforcement. At seminars on cold cases, Cole often spoke about it. How easy it is for evidence to disappear, whether by negligence or intent. How boring financial crimes can escalate to violence. How a janitor, not a detective, was the one who reopened the door. She often said, "The lesson is simple. Crime hides best where no one bothers to look. And sometimes it takes an ordinary person to see what professionals missed." The mystery of Detective Briggs. One unresolved piece lingered. Why had Detective Harold Briggs hidden the file in the first place? Was he corrupt, pressured, or quietly trying to preserve evidence he couldn't officially pursue? Cole never found a definitive answer, but she leaned toward the darker theory. Briggs had been known to drink heavily in his later years. In a bar conversation recorded by Internal Affairs in 1981, he was overheard saying, "Sometimes you've got a case you can't touch. You just wall it up and pray someone else opens it someday." If true, his prayer had been answered by a janitor's mop. The reflection. In the end, the Harper case is not a story of triumph, no convictions, no justice served in a courtroom. It is a story of silence. A man who tried to speak up. A system that buried him. A file sealed in a wall for decades. And then, the smallest accident, a janitor sweeping dust, pulled the silence back into the light. What it means. When people think of crime, they imagine violence in alleys, spectacular heists, bloody headlines. But Harper's murder was the opposite. It was an accountant with a ledger, ghost names on a payroll, a missing briefcase. A boring crime that was anything but. It reminds us that behind every stack of old papers may be a truth someone worked hard to erase. And behind every unsolved file may be a life lived with courage, even if no one saw it at the time. And so the question lingers, even now. If a janitor had not found that file, would Daniel Harper have been forgotten forever? And how many more Harpers still lie hidden in basements, behind panels, waiting for anyone to sweep them into the open? In a small Pennsylvania town in the mid-1990s, neighbors began to whisper about the mail. Checks arrived late, birthday cards never showed up, packages vanished between sender and receiver. Some people blamed careless clerks, others blamed thieves rifling through mailboxes. But the truth was stranger and much closer than anyone imagined. Because the thief wasn't a stranger on the street. It was the man in the blue-gray uniform, the one who waved cheerfully each morning, carrying a leather satchel and whistling as he went from house to house. His name was Albert "Al" Finch, and for more than 2 decades, he stole from the very letters he was trusted to deliver. A trusted figure, Albert Finch joined the U.S. Postal Service in 1973. Back then, a mailman was more than just a worker. In small towns, he was part of the social fabric, checking on the elderly, greeting children at the school bus stop, carrying not only mail but also the gossip of the neighborhood. Albert fit the role perfectly. He was polite, punctual, and unassuming. Neighbors described him as one of those people you never think twice about. But beneath that trust, a slow, quiet pattern of theft was taking root. How it began. Investigators would later piece together that Albert's theft started small. A dollar bill slipped inside a greeting card, loose change in a padded envelope, a magazine subscription check that never reached its publisher. At first, he rationalized it. The letter was probably lost anyway. It's just a few dollars. No one will miss it. But over time, the small thefts became habit. Then they became routine. By the early 1980s, Albert was systematically rifling through mail on his root-slitting envelopes with a small blade, pocketing cash or checks, then resealing them just enough to pass unnoticed. The scale of the theft. For years, no one connected the dots. A missing letter here, a delayed package there, chalked up to the quirks of the postal system. But Albert's theft stretched far beyond his route. Whenever he was assigned to sort mail at the local distribution center, he skimmed through bags of letters bound for other towns. Anything that looked like a card, a check, or a money order was fair game. Over 2 decades, he stole tens of thousands of letters. The value was impossible to calculate, but estimates put it at hundreds of thousands of dollars cash, checks, gift cards, even the occasional piece of jewelry. The hidden stash. What made Albert's case extraordinary wasn't just the theft, it was what he did with the stolen mail. He didn't destroy it. He hoarded it. In 1997, when investigators finally raided his home, they found entire rooms filled with stolen letters, shoe boxes stacked to the ceiling, plastic bins overflowing with envelopes, a garage piled high with sacks of undelivered mail. Some of it had been opened, cash and valuables removed, but much of it was untouched, never delivered, never returned, just kept. Neighbors described the discovery as like stepping into a post office frozen in time. The neighbors' suspicions. Looking back, some neighbors admitted they had suspected something odd. One recalled seeing Albert carrying unusually heavy bags on days when his route was short. Another remembered him burning large piles of paper in his backyard, the smoke smelling of ink and glue. But no one questioned him. After all, he was the postman. Who questions the postman? The first complaint. The investigation began in 1996 with a single complaint. A woman reported that her elderly mother's Social Security checks had gone missing 3 months in a row. Postal inspectors looked into it, expecting a clerical error. Instead, they found multiple similar complaints on Finch's route. When they began quietly monitoring, the pattern was unmistakable. Letters disappeared almost exclusively when Finch handled them. The sting operation. Postal inspectors set up a controlled sting. They planted letters on Finch's route, each containing marked bills and fitted with invisible tracer powder. Within hours of his shift, Finch returned home. Agents followed. When they knocked on his door, they found the marked bills in his wallet and his hands glowing faintly under ultraviolet light from the tracer powder. The evidence was undeniable. The arrest. Neighbors were stunned when uniformed inspectors led Albert Finch out of his home in handcuffs. One woman said, "We trusted him with our lives, our checks, our secrets, and he was stealing from us all along." Another added, "It wasn't just theft, it was betrayal." The question of motive. Why did Albert do it? It wasn't greed, at least not in the usual sense. His house was modest. He drove an old car. He didn't gamble, drink heavily, or flaunt wealth. When questioned, Finch said quietly, "It just became a habit. I couldn't stop. Every envelope felt like it might hold something." Psychologists later suggested his hoarding was as compulsive as his theft. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing possession of people's words, their gifts, their private exchanges. But how did the investigation unfold in court? And what did Albert's 20 years of theft mean for the people whose lives he quietly disrupted, letter by letter? When inspectors raided Albert Finch's home in 1997, the sheer volume of mail stunned even veteran investigators. It wasn't just theft, it was archaeology. There were envelopes from the 1970s, yellowed and brittle. Christmas cards decades old, their glitter dulled by dust. Wedding invitations, condolence notes, postcards from vacations never received. Whole lives sat in boxes, undelivered. And for the U.S. Postal Service, it was one of the largest internal betrayals in memory. Cataloging the evidence. For months after Finch's arrest, postal inspectors worked in shifts cataloging the seized letters. They opened them carefully, photographing contents and recording names. Some were rerouted to surviving relatives, though in many cases, the intended recipients had long since passed away. One inspector recalled, "We'd find a birthday card with $5 in it, meant for a child in 1983. That child was now in their 20s. The parents were gone. The moment had been stolen forever." The emotional weight of the letters proved as damaging as the financial losses. The indictment. Federal prosecutors charged Finch with theft of mail by a postal employee, obstruction of correspondence, possession of stolen mail. The charges covered only a fraction of the stolen items those investigators could prove had been tampered with. But even so, the potential sentence was decades in federal prison. The indictment listed over 1,000 pieces of stolen mail as evidence. The town's reaction. In his community, the case landed like a bomb. At town meetings, residents lined up to vent their anger. One man claimed Finch had stolen a $500 money order meant for his daughter's college tuition. Another swore Finch had kept her husband's letters during his deployment in Desert Storm. An elderly widow broke down describing how birthday cards from her grandchildren had never arrived. Some accused the Postal Service of failing to act sooner, knotting years of complaints. The town's trust in its most ordinary institution, the daily delivery of mail, had been shaken. The defense strategy. Finch's defense attorney faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. So they didn't dispute the thefts. Instead, they argued that Finch suffered from compulsive hoarding disorder, driven by psychological need rather than criminal intent. He hadn't sold the stolen items. He hadn't lived lavishly. He had simply kept them. The attorney told the court, "Mr. Finch is not a thief in the traditional sense. He is a sick man, trapped in a cycle of compulsion, overwhelmed by mail he could neither deliver nor destroy." The prosecution's argument. The prosecutors countered sharply. This wasn't compulsion, they said. This was theft sustained, deliberate, and corrosive. Finch had deprived citizens of vital documents, checks, insurance forms, legal notices. He had stolen money from elderly recipients who depended on Social Security and veterans' benefits. Most damningly, he had abused a position of public trust. When you steal a letter, you don't just steal paper. You steal communication, you steal trust, you steal time. The trial testimonies. Witness after witness took the stand. A woman who had never received the last letter her dying father sent. A man whose small business failed after checks from clients went missing. A child, now grown, who never got the card from her grandmother that she later found in Finch's garage. Each testimony painted the same picture. Finch's theft wasn't just financial, it was personal. He had stolen moments of connection. The psychiatric evaluation. Court-appointed psychiatrists evaluated Finch. Their report concluded he did not suffer from dissociative disorder. He did exhibit traits of compulsive hoarding and kleptomania. He was aware his actions were wrong, but appeared powerless to stop. They described his house as a museum of silence, letters stacked like artifacts, as if he were preserving them rather than destroying them. But the law, they stressed, could not ignore awareness of wrongdoing. The verdict. After 3 weeks of trial, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Finch was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments to affected families. The sentence reflected both punishment and deterrence, a message that even small thefts by postal employees could not be tolerated. The redelivered mail. In the months after sentencing, the Postal Service made efforts to deliver what mail it could. But many items were undeliverable, addresses no longer existed, families had moved, recipients had died. Stacks of undeliverable letters were placed in sealed archive boxes, labeled, "Recovered Mail, Finch Case." They became part of the Postal Inspection Service's training exhibits, reminders of how trust can be broken. But what became of Albert Finch after prison? And what does his case reveal about the fragile bond between ordinary people and the institutions they trust most? When Albert Finch walked into federal prison in 1998, he carried with him not just a conviction, but the weight of 2 decades of stolen communication. The case was filed away as another instance of corruption in public service. But for the people whose lives he quietly disrupted, the echoes lingered long after the trial was over. Life behind bars. In prison, Finch was not treated as a violent offender. He was housed in a low-security facility, surrounded mostly by white-collar criminals and non-violent drug offenders. But his fellow inmates gave him a nickname, the Mailman. Some mocked him for the banality of his crime. Others envied his ability to steal for 20 years without being caught. Finch himself remained quiet. He worked in the prison library, shelving books with the same methodical care he had once applied to letters. Guards described him as polite, withdrawn, and rarely in trouble. When asked why he did it, he gave the same answer he'd given in court. "I couldn't stop. Every envelope felt like it belonged to me just for a moment." The reputational fallout. For the U.S. Postal Service, the Finch scandal was a public relations disaster. Surveys at the time showed a dip in public trust toward mail delivery, with headlines branding Finch as the postman thief. The Postal Inspection Service responded by increasing random route audits, surveillance at distribution centers, and undercover stings against employees suspected of theft. The Finch case became part of training manuals, a warning to new recruits. Trust is fragile, and one breach can tarnish the entire system. The victims' long memories. Even after Finch's conviction, some victims never let go of the anger. One man still kept a photocopy of a missing insurance check, saying, "That piece of paper ruined me." He may have seen it and tossed it aside. A widow told reporters that Finch had stolen the last words from her husband, who had written her from a hospital before dying. Others admitted they began to distrust not just Finch, but the entire mail system, preferring hand delivery, couriers, or later, email. For them, the betrayal wasn't abstract, it was personal. The quiet release. Finch served 8 years of his 10-year sentence and was released in 2006 at age 59. By then, the world had changed. Email had overtaken handwritten letters. Online banking had replaced checks in envelopes. Packages moved with barcodes and tracking numbers. The very medium of his theft, physical mail, was fading. Finch returned to a modest life, living in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of town. He never married. He took occasional odd jobs but never returned to steady work. Neighbors who later learned of his past described him as lonely, polite, and invisible. The legacy of the letters. What happened to the mountains of mail? Some were returned to families. Others, deemed undeliverable, were stored in federal archives. A portion remained sealed, part of the Postal Inspection Service's internal collection. Inspectors used them in training programs, showing new recruits the boxes of undelivered Christmas cards, birthday notes, and checks as a tangible reminder. This is what theft looks like. It doesn't look like a bank robbery, it looks like absence. The broader lesson. Finch's case revealed a truth uncomfortable for many, that the most enduring crimes are often quiet, repetitive, and invisible until they're too big to ignore. No gunfire, no headlines, just one man day after day pocketing pieces of other people's lives. Over 20 years, the thefts became a kind of erosion. Not one grand act, but thousands of tiny cuts against trust. And because the victims were scattered, one missing letter here, one vanished check there, the crime persisted for decades without anyone connecting the dots. The reflection. When Finch died quietly in 2012, his obituary made no mention of his crime. It simply listed him as a retired postal worker. But for those who remembered, the story of the postman who stole letters was a parable about ordinary corruption. How power doesn't need to be grand to be abused. How betrayal can come from the most familiar faces. How silence and routine can cloak even the strangest compulsions. As one inspector later reflected, he didn't just steal money, he stole time. He stole words that were never spoken. He stole connections that can't be rebuilt. That's a crime you can't measure in dollars.